Right. So we have the two committee members now. Dr. Lehnen, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, no, that's all right.
Should have been my calendar as a team meeting, so I went there and then I realized, oh, it's actually a Zoom. So.
All right. I think we've got Dr. Young is here. I think we've got everyone. All right, so we can get started here. So here we are at the second proposal. Thesis proposal defense of the day for the Kline lab. Caitlin Brett is going to be presenting her proposed work. And so we have the committee here, which is composed of Dr. Søren Lehnen from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dr. John Young from Texas Department of Transportation, and myself, Dr. Richard Kline, UTRGV. Caitlin is pursuing a Master of Science in the AESS program, which is Agricultural, Environmental, and Sustainability Sciences here at UTRGV. So Caitlin came to us a year ago, basically, and she got her BS in Landscape Architecture from Ohio State University. She's also worked professionally as a landscape planner. She's done some work as a wildlife biology intern for the Mexican Spotted Owl Project, and also as a research technician at North Dakota State University as an apiary pollen sampler extension. She's been a big help and a great addition to our research group here, working on FM 106 and the wildlife mortalities and mitigation project that we're doing here, trying to monitor these animals through the underpasses and also looking at them across the landscape to see the effect of these structures. So the scenario today will be Caitlin will present her proposed work. After she's finished, there'll be time for questions from the audience. And then after we've given some time to the audience, we'll ask the audience to leave. And so the thesis committee will be able to ask her specific questions about her proposal in private. I would ask you all to mute your microphones if you haven't already while Caitlin presents her work. All right, Caitlin, so she's going to be presenting on South Texas wildlife activity across a fragmented landscape and road mitigation corridor. Take it away.
All right, great. Thank you so much for the intro there, Dr. Kline. As you said, I'm Caitlin Brett, and I'll be presenting looking at wildlife activity across a fragmented landscape and road mitigation corridor. So we'll be going over a brief introduction of the road ecology project here, and then looking at some background in the field on our specific study area, and then looking at the specifics of my proposed study. So again, that Cliffs Notes version here is that there were several of these wildlife crossing structures installed under Farm to Market Road 106 in South Texas here, primarily to mitigate habitat fragmentation and prevent ocelot mortalities on those roads. However, the effects of the road itself, as well as its mitigation structures, hasn't been fully studied across the wildlife community. And so our proposed study pairs an analysis of camera trap data, both from roadside sites and habitat sites, to evaluate the performance of these crossing structures, as well as to describe the extent of the road's impact on the landscape and to model wildlife activity in the surrounding area. So in the continental US alone, just rural roadways and freeways make up about 1% of our landmass, which may not seem like much unless you consider the indirect effects that these can have on ecological systems. So about 20% of the US is located within 150 meters of a road, and about 80% is located within just a kilometer. So you're really within short walking distance of a road from any point in the US. The direct effects of roads can include things like wildlife vehicle collisions and resultant mortalities. There can also be destruction and degradation of the habitat at the roadway itself. And then the indirect effects can include things like physical and chemical pollution and invasive species introductions, sensory disturbances, things like light and noise that can alter animal behavior or phenology or movement. And because these impact different portions of the wildlife community differently, these can lead to altered trophic interactions within the community. And then, of course, a big one we'll be talking about today is habitat fragmentation, which in severe cases for certain populations can lead to genetic isolation for populations which are bisected by roadways. And so the cumulative term to describe all of these effects is the road effect zone. And in previous studies, this estimates of the road effect zone have ranged anywhere from tens of meters, like less than 300 meters, to over 5 kilometers. And this really varies depending on the roadway conditions and the taxa that you're studying and the overall ecosystem that you're in. So to start to address some of these impacts of roadways on wildlife, one of the first steps managers often take is to install exclusion fencing, which of course can prevent mortalities by preventing wildlife from entering the roadway at all. But if you think about it, this can actually make the results of habitat fragmentation worse for local communities. So a lot of times these will be paired with wildlife crossing structures. Those can look like a lot of different things depending on what species you're looking at conserving. On the top right here, you can see the underpass structures that were built for ocelots in South Texas. And these generally, if the fencing around them is able to funnel wildlife movement towards the structures, these can prevent mortalities while also improving habitat connectivity throughout the area. But of course, this is only if they're successfully designed and placed on the landscape. So there's an important distinction between monitoring the use of these structures versus the performance of these structures. In the following scenario, we have crossings X, Y, and Z here. And if you were just studying the use of these structures, so like what animals are seen using crossing and using the structures, you might come to the conclusion here that crossing X is the most successful because we see the most activity in the structure. But this doesn't really account for habitat heterogeneity or differences in wildlife movement through the surrounding habitat. So if you were to also monitor that surrounding habitat, you would get an idea of the performance of these structures by comparing the expected use versus the actual use. And in this scenario, it seems like that first crossing was actually quite well placed. There's a lot of animal activity in the surrounding area, which seems to have led to activity in the crossing. But in this case, crossing Z here actually seems like it has a more successful design because it's attracting more activity in the crossing structure compared to movement in the surrounding landscape. So you get very different conclusions based of the designs of these structures based on which monitoring system you're using. And this is important because in studies where you're looking at different designs and different placement, you really have to control for placement before making any conclusions about the design of these crossing structures. Which of course is the case here on the FM 106 corridor. We have 8 different crossing structures. And this is actually one of 2 corridors studied by UTRGV here in Cameron County. And these 8 structures have slightly varied designs. They're all prefabricated concrete, but they have different dimensions and slightly different structures to them. And so we'll be monitoring the performance in order to evaluate the success of our mitigation goals on the project. Hang on. 2 of those goals are first to prevent ocelot mortalities, and second to reduce the overall barrier effect of FM 106. So in other words, to improve habitat connectivity for the overall wildlife community. So the ocelot, if you're not familiar, is a neotropical felid native throughout much of Central and South America, and historically was native throughout much of the Gulf Coast of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Today, those populations are limited to estimated less than 100 individuals in the south of Texas. You can see here the northernmost population is up in Willacy County, whereas the southernmost population, these are the two known and well-documented populations of these. The southernmost one is located in Cameron County on and around the Laguna de Escosa National Wildlife Refuge. And so, sorry, the reason for these population declines is largely due to destruction of the ocelot's native thorn scrub habitat, largely due to agricultural land use and development in the area. You can also see here how increasing urban sprawl and road networks have led to reinforced habitat fragmentation and genetic isolation between these populations, and has also over the years resulted in dozens of ocelot mortalities on these roadways. In just one long-term study, about 35% of documented ocelot deaths were from road mortalities. But of course, the ocelot is not the only individual down here, and it does not exist in a vacuum. So like many of these other species in the South Texas wildlife community are likely facing similar pressures from habitat loss, fragmentation, and increasing road networks. So our study will not just be focusing on the ocelot, but a much larger portion of the wildlife community. Of our 14 expected target species, about half of those associate closely with the dense woody cover that is also preferred by the ocelot, that's thorn scrub habitat. However, like in much of the valley, this thorn scrub is very limited on our study area, both in scope and in connectivity. There's, in addition to FM106, there are several secondary roads which support residential communities and a few major facilities on our study area, which also divide up that thorn scrub. Some of these include the Port Isabel Detention Center, the Laguna de Escosa National Wildlife Refuge headquarters, as well as a local regional airport on the study area. And in addition to that thorn scrub, agricultural land use, primarily cotton and sorghum crops, makes up a large portion of the study area, about a quarter of it. And the rest is a mix of salt flat communities, which experience seasonal and shallow inundation, and then coastal prairie and savanna grasslands, largely dominated by mesquite. Oh, sorry. And it's important in this case to study how species within target species in the wildlife community interact with these different land cover types so that we can better inform future designs and placement of crossing structures. So with all of that in mind, the objectives for this study are first to describe the road effect zone of FM106 up to 1 kilometer away from the roadway. Second, to model land cover characteristics, which might help us predict target wildlife species detections throughout the study corridor. And finally, to determine the performance of each of our wildlife crossing structures. So in order to do that, we really set up two different camera trap arrays. The first focuses on roadside study sites. So these include wildlife crossing structures, as well as unmitigated right-of-way sites, which were placed in areas where we anticipate animals are crossing the road in the absence of any fencing or mitigation structures. The right-of-way sites will have 2 camera traps, 1 on each side of the road. And then, as you can see here, the wildlife crossing structure array actually has 4 cameras at each entrance. So you can see 3 of those are pointed towards the entrance of the structure, and then 1 is facing away directly into the surrounding habitat. All in all, these roadside sites include 72 camera traps visited on a bi-weekly basis, and their primary goal is to monitor animal behavior and their interactions with the crossing structures and the right-of-way. However, by themselves, these provide no comparable data to assess the performance of the structures and no way to detect avoidance behavior by certain species, and thereby no way to anticipate the size of the road effect zone. So in addition to the roadside sites, we also set up camera traps in the surrounding habitat. This included 36 cameras visited on a monthly basis, deployed over this past summer. And their primary goal is to monitor habitat up to 1 kilometer east and west of the FM 106 roadway. The selection of these sites was somewhat limited because of private land use. We were limited to land that was owned by the National Wildlife Refuge, but then we were also limited to some degree by, there's some areas where we couldn't place cameras due to management plans on the refuge. So you can see those areas where we were not allowed to place cameras highlighted in orange there. And we also structured our site selection using a stratified random site selection process. And this was largely because, as we discussed before, thorn scrub on the landscape is fairly limited, but our crossing structures tend to be placed within or very close to patches of thorn scrub. And so in order to match conditions at the crossing structures and set up a clear comparison of surrounding habitat versus those structures, we wanted to match those conditions by representing thorn scrub in our habitat study sites as well. And so in practice, what this looked like was we set up a few different factors, and then within those factors selected randomly for the habitat sites. The first factor was vegetation class. That was based on the percentage of canopy cover at each of those sites. We had open, mixed, and dense categories for those. And then we also structured based on the distance to the road. So we had at 300 and 600, we had 3 different bins, 300 and 600 meters were the thresholds for 3 different distance bins to be set up. And then also the sites were selected evenly from east and west sides of the road so that we could get an idea of the road effect zone throughout the corridor. So to actually go about selecting those sites, we use ArcGIS to overlay a 50 by 50 meter grid over all available area, and then delineate 15-meter radius sites within each of those cells. These were then numbered and randomly selected and evaluated individually. So this is an example. If we had selected this one, we would have identified it as a dense site on the west side of the road, 600 to 1,000 meters away. And so basically that site selection process continued until all of those categories were filled evenly. And all in all gave us 36 primary sites, as well as a list of backups to use in case we had to relocate or reject sites for any reason on the ground. So once we had that list of sites, we set about trying to actually find a spot to place our cameras within that area. Our primary requirements for camera placement were that we needed a few meters of clearable or maintainable vegetation to prevent any interference with the cameras. And we also tried to keep them all as close to north facing as possible to avoid interference from sun glare with our photos. And once those first 2 requirements were fulfilled, we conducted canopy cover surveys at each of the sites using a densitometer to get an idea of the actual value to confirm that our expected veg class was the same as it was on the ground. We would also consider rejecting or relocating sites based on any accessibility issues or safety concerns or risk of equipment loss due to things like flooding. So once we selected a final spot for camera placement, we attached the camera cases to U-posts and drove them into the ground so that all of our camera heights set at about 50 to 55 centimeters from the ground. We also angled them slightly so that the detection zones of these cameras would maximize captures for both small and large species. And we set a 3-meter reference mark so that regardless of how far the camera could see into the surrounding area, we were only measuring a set distance for each camera, regardless of vegetation type. And also vegetation was cleared in a 2.5-meter arc ahead of each camera, again, to prevent any interference with our photos. And so these cameras are revisited every 4 weeks to exchange SD cards, make sure they're functioning properly, and to cut back any regrowth of vegetation. So camera trapping itself is great and offers a lot of advantages over other detection methods because it can monitor multiple species at a time without much additional survey effort. It provides non-invasive footage of behaviors that you might not be able to capture with other detection methods. It's increasingly resource efficient. As I said, these are really low maintenance devices. And because of the passive infrared mechanism that drives the camera, it's detecting changes in heat across that field of view. And so that's really well suited for medium to large mammals, which is our focus. And it can pick up elusive species that you might not expect to even get using other detection methods. And so this returns us thousands and thousands of camera photos on a biweekly basis. And in order to process all of that and turn it into usable data, we use two primary pieces of software. The first one is Renamer, which extracts the date time that each photo was taken at. And then we go about sorting the photos to which species and how many individuals were identified in each photo. And then we use Data Organize, a program that tabulates all that information that we can then convert into a spreadsheet format. An important distinction here is that a detection event is actually not an individual photo, but often a series of photos. So in this case, we had a possum that walked across the camera and triggered it 4 times, resulting in 4 photos. But that would not equate to 4 observations, but rather since they occurred back to back, this would be grouped into a single detection event. This definition of a detection event is our primary response variable for most of our analyses. And say there was another possum that occurred 30 minutes after this event, that would be considered as a distinct detection event from this one. So if it occurs within 30 minutes, we assume that it's the same individual and group it accordingly. That makes sense to everybody. Okay, so what gets extracted after all of that is lines of data with the site that the photo is taken at, what species is identified, how many individuals there are, and then the date time that the photo was taken. So all in all, our roadside and habitat sites are treated in most of the same way for our data collection and processing. There are a few differences. The primary one being that roadside sites actually take a lot of redundant footage. They're set to take 3 photos per trigger, and there's also that video camera setup, which might seem like a lot of overkill if you're just comparing the detection events. But those roadside sites are also set up to, again, look at behavior at the crossing structures. And so all of that extra footage is used to conduct interactions. So telling us what behavior these animals are exhibiting at the crossing structures. All right, so circling back to those objectives I mentioned earlier, the first again is to describe the road effect zone of the FM 106 corridor. And within this objective, we'll be first setting up a multiple regression to test whether distance to the road affects target species detections and richness. And we'll also be looking at, in that case, if woody cover that occurs between the site and the road plays a role in buffering the extent of the road effect zone. The second objective, or the second hypothesis here, is that we'll also be looking at dial activity for each of our species, our target species, and hypothesizing that target species activity during peak hours of traffic will increase the farther you are away from the road. So indicating that a lot of species have, or that the road is negatively impacting species activity during peak hours. And that will be done using an R package called Overlap, which compares essentially the dial activity curve of 2 different groups. So in this case, it would be the group closer to the road and then one farther away from the road. And by comparing those, it can tell you if there's any significant differences. The takeaways here is that we can potentially identify road avoidance behaviors for certain species, while also determining if land cover affects the road effect zone in this region. For our second objective, which is to, again, look at those land cover characteristics that might help us predict target species detections, We're first going to look at a multivariate analysis using Permanova. This will not only look at vegetation class bins, but also those distance bins, and see if either individually or interactive, if they have a significant impact on the faunal communities represented in each of those groups. And so our prediction here is that with a simpler analysis, the similarity within these significant categories or communities will be driven by fewer species in open sites compared to mixed or dense sites. And this generally will help us just characterize the mitigation corridor and the wildlife activity within it. The second hypothesis here is that woody cover availability, distance to any type of road, and distance to a water source will help us model target species detections. This will probably be limited to a subset of our target species, but that will be done using a multiple regression after comparing those factors to see if there's any multicollinearity between them. And this also will inform crossing structure placement for the future potentially, and potentially inform the necessity and placement of mitigation fencing along our corridor, since it is not completely fenced, but is localized at this time. Okay, and for our third objective, which again is to determine the performance of each of these structures, we first hypothesized that all of our structures will have positive performance differentials, which is calculated by subtracting expected crossing frequency from actual crossing frequency. Again, looking at that comparison using surrounding habitat data versus at the structures. And so we hypothesized that all of our crossing structures will exhibit positive performance differentials, indicating that they're used more often than can be expected based on comparable habitat detections. For that analysis, that's really just like a manual calculation that's done for each of the crossing structures. And then we'll go ahead and take that performance differential and run a multiple regression using openness ratio, fence length, and local woody cover availability to determine if any of those local design factors influence the performance of the structures. And both of these analyses can potentially inform future crossing structure designs and could be used for comparison with that other corridor I talked about on SH100. So in general, we expect data collection to go through May of this upcoming spring. And then if all goes well, I'll have time to organize and analyze all of my stats and defend the thesis by the end of next August. Okay, so I'd like to take this time to thank all of the members of my committee and everyone who has helped with this, this project so far with all their feedback. Doctors Kline, Young, and Lehnen. I also wanted to thank TxDOT for the funding support, US Fish and Wildlife for land access permission, and obviously much appreciated moral support and fieldwork from all of you people. Miles, Tori, Anna, Adam, Alexa, Molly, and also Madison and Jamie. I'm sorry, I forgot you guys. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions from the audience.
All right, good job, Caitlin. Let's have time. Questions from the audience? Caitlin? Looks like Anna Menor has a question.
Yes,
What are you considering? Sorry, what are you considering your peak traffic hours?
that's a great question. And I will probably ask some of my fellow researchers who are currently working on looking at traffic volumes on the FM 106 corridor.
Cool, thank you.
I had a quick question. I was just wondering, with your video and camera traps, if you had seen any particular species that has its behavior altered in a significant way by the crossing. Like, are they apprehensive of it? Or?
Sure, yeah, I can definitely speak just anecdotally. There's plenty of species that I mean, we'll see them approach the crossing structure, and for whatever reason, whether it's like if fear of like a novel thing on the landscape, or maybe there's a truck that goes by at that moment, you'll see them react to that pretty quickly and back away from the structure. I would say probably the biggest suspect or biggest repeat observation there is by coyotes. They tend to be pretty skittish in general. But a lot of other species, you'll see them just like march right through like it's their day to day. So really depends on probably how much time has gone by and what species you're looking at.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you think you'll see a lot of like differences between like the west and east side? Because I mean, I don't know for sure, but I know you like balanced it, but I know from visual observation, like, is it most of the refuge like on that, on the like,
Yeah, the
western
east and
side?
the, yeah, I don't know if you guys could hear just now, Marissa asked about differences between the east and west sides of the road. I think it's definitely something we'll look at kind of embedded within our other analyses. Yeah, you pointed out that there's more refuge property on the north and east sides of the road. And I think as Tori mentioned earlier, that's generally where the ocelot population might be coming from. So we're not entirely sure yet. Obviously, we haven't run any data. And also that some of that property on the south and west that is technically owned by Laguna now was only recently purchased. So it used to be farmland. So it's really, it's
So
their
not
property,
really
but
their
it's,
habitat.
yeah, it's not quite yet really hospitable habitat for a lot of species. But yeah, that'll definitely be an interesting comparison. Anybody else?
I had one more question about the crossings. I was wondering if you had noticed or if there's any research on kind of predation within or around these crossings, and like if there is an effect, how are you going to control for that if you see one in your study?
Yeah, totally. That's actually, that's called like the prey trap hypothesis. So there's been a lot of work. I would say there's no conclusive evidence either way that I know of. Obviously, it'll differ depending on what region, what species you're looking at. We have seen, again, anecdotally, just instances where we see suspected hunting behavior at the crossing structures. But without comparing that to hunting behavior in the surrounding habitat, you can't really tell if that's just like the normal amount of detections of hunting behavior that you would get, or if it's higher at the crossing structures for whatever reason.
Right.
It's definitely a possibility that I think I might look into, and a few other people on the project might look into.
Awesome, cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, maybe one last question if anyone has one. Caitlin, I have one for you.
Okay.
So what are some limitations in making your habitat array in terms of how the landscape is used?
So do you mean as far as different habitat structure, or limitations on where we could place the cameras?
Where you could place and how you could represent the surrounding habitat.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a little bit that we were limited to just the land owned by the refuge. Some of the other limitations were things like land access issues, like just getting to sites that we're potentially selecting. We stayed away from areas which had an excessive amount of cord grass. If you're not familiar, it's a large native bunch grass that's native to the area, but it's really difficult to maintain the camera field of view without getting a lot of ghost triggers in those areas. But they're also generally considered to be pretty poor for most species activity. So we were slightly limited. And we also didn't want to place in any, as I mentioned, the recently purchased agricultural parcels. Since they were still tilling those, we didn't want to risk any equipment loss. So there, and again, there were the activity by the refuge where they were managing for I think they're managing for coastal prairie. So by removing mesquite and potentially burning in certain areas, we didn't want to put cameras in those areas either.
All right, thank you. So I guess that will complete the public portion of Caitlin's thesis proposal defense. So I'd ask to thank everyone and then ask you to log off so the committee may ask more questions.
All right, thanks, everybody. Thanks. Don't listen to them grilling me too hard. Oh, cool. Thank you.
So I have a quick question for you.
Yeah,
Since
sure.
Dr. Kline brought it up, and you're trying to